Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun is France's last great portraitist, the most famous in Europe. A child prodigy, taught by her father, she starts painting professionally at the age of 14. Ambitious and independent, she gains access to the highest levels of power by becoming portraitist to Queen Marie Antoinette. Energetic and determined, she'll produce over 660 portraits. Because of her close ties to the royal court, she's forced to flee into exile during the French Revolution. This period of exile, which she imagined would last only 6 months, will last 13 years, taking her to all the royal courts of Europe. She'll live in Italy, Austria, England, and Russia. A friend of the rich and powerful and the greatest artists of her time, she'll be acclaimed in all the royal courts and art academies of Europe. Her destiny is that of a talented and free woman who managed to combine success and fortune. She'll declare in her memoirs, "Before the revolution, women ruled. The revolution dethroned them."
My very dear friend, you urge me so warmly to write my memoirs for you that I have decided to satisfy your desire. Imagine what it will mean to my heart to recall the various events I have witnessed. And the friends who exist no more, save in my thought. Nevertheless, the task will be an easy one, for my heart loves to remember. And in my hours of loneliness, those dear departed friends surround me still. So vivid do they appear to my imagination.
Louise Élisabeth Vigée was born in Paris in April 1755, a few months before Marie Antoinette. 18th century France saw the growth of a practice of major significance, wet nursing. Middle-class women, the wives of artisans and merchants, send their children to neighboring villages in order to be free to carry out their activities. Shortly after her birth, little Élisabeth will be entrusted to a wet nurse in the Épernay region of Normandy. In 1761, her father Louis comes to take her home. Élisabeth, now aged 6, discovers a father she doesn't know and has to say goodbye to her foster family. She'll spend a few weeks in the family apartment in Paris, Rue de Cléry, where she'll discover the day-to-day life of her parents, her brother Etienne, 3 years younger than herself, and especially her father's work.
Her father was a pastel portraitist, a member of the Academy of St. Luc Artists Guild. He was a man who sought out the company of musicians, poets, and wits.
Court life and the growth of a wealthy Parisian middle class account for the increasing popularity of the portrait. Latour, Van Loo, Greuze, or Drouet will be the fashionable masters of this art.
Everyone wanted their portrait painted. There was no other way to preserve your likeness in that age.
Pastels artist Louis Vigée, whilst not having the genius of the great masters, has acquired a fairly large clientele. Artists, nobles, and burghers all sit for him.
I mention these facts to show what an inborn passion for the art I possessed. My father, whose name was Vigée, made very good pastel drawings. He did some portraits which would have been worthy of the famous Latour. But coming back to the pleasures I enjoyed in my childhood home, I must tell you that my father allowed me to paint several heads in pastels and also to dabble with his crayons all day.
Her father adored her, and he would give her free rein when he would let her in his studio, take his pastel boxes and start drawing.
Her father is very encouraging of her talent, and one day, after seeing a drawing she did of a bearded man, exclaims, "You will be a painter, child, if there ever was one."
After a few short weeks spent in the family home, Élisabeth is sent to boarding school at the Trinity Convent in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. At 6 years old, she's one of its youngest pupils. While boys are educated in schools or through private tutors, girls from the upper and middle classes are mainly educated in convents. They're taught very little: biblical history, the basics of sewing and writing, in order to prepare them for their future roles as companionable wives and mothers. At the age of 11, she leaves the convent.
Her father undertakes to train her and sends her to one of his friends, a painter called Deven, who teaches her how to set a palette.
These future artists in painting, pastels, or drawing are going to meet other masters during their youth. Madame Vigée Le Brun will have a lot of admiration for artists such as Jean-Baptiste Greuze and Joseph Verne. She'll observe them, question them, and listen to their advice on how to improve.
Élisabeth continues her apprenticeship, but is soon going to lose her first teacher.
I had just spent one happy year in my parents' house when my father fell ill. My mother wept day and night. As for myself, I will not attempt to describe my desolation. I was about to lose the best of fathers, my support, my guide, the one whose indulgence encouraged my first attempts.
In order to distract her from her grief, her mother, Jeanne, takes her to see the private collections of masterpieces exhibited to the public, such as that of the Duke of Orléans, where Élisabeth gets to know the great European painters and develops her taste.
She had no real formal training. She took courses here and there, dabbled in but you can't say she's self-taught, actually.
At the age of 12, in order to help her mother and pay for her young brother's schooling, Élisabeth is obliged to work.
Her talent soon becomes noticed, in particular through two portraits, which reveal her precocious artistic maturity.
The portrait of her brother Etienne dressed as a schoolboy, which she's believed to have painted at the age of 14, and that of her mother, are so well done that they're talked about in Paris. Commissions soon begin to flow in. A year after the death of her husband, Jeanne Messin marries a rich jeweler, Jacques-François Lesèvre, to whom Élisabeth and Etienne are openly hostile.
When the young girl starts to receive payment for her first commission portraits, Lesèvre considers that this money belongs to him, and he uses it for himself.
Élisabeth rapidly builds up a large clientele of artists, burghers, and nobles. Her fees increase, and she starts earning a lot of money. For the gentleman models who gaze at her too insistently, she devises a clever trick to turn their eyes away from her.
As for those gentlemen, as soon as I realized they wished to make eyes at me, I would paint them with their gaze averted, which prevents the sitter from looking at the painter. At the least movement of their pupils in my direction, I would say, "I'm doing the eyes now." This would vex them a little, as you can imagine, and my mother, who was always present and whom I had taken into my confidence, would laugh to herself.
In fact, Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun practically invents this masculine theme, that of the pre-romantic character gazing off into the distance, eyes raised up to heaven, his thoughts elsewhere. In this way, she diverts the man's eyes and possible amorous intentions away from her. So she shows intelligence there too, wiliness, I'd say, in the way she deals with this situation.
Despite her numerous commissions, Élisabeth finds time to enjoy the favorite pastime of 18th century Parisians, going out for a stroll. Nobles and gentry, artisans, merchants, and scamps pass each other by in the Tuileries gardens, in the squares of the Champs-Élysées, in the Luxembourg and Palais Royal gardens, where Élisabeth and her family live. When out strolling, you have to see, and especially be seen. Fashionable gathering places are created and last for a brief time, such as the Colosseum. Located in one of the Champs-Élysées squares, this amusement site, illuminated by 2,000 candles, could hold 40,000 people. Its attractions included cafes, circuses, trinket and curiosity shops, a show hall, a ball, and a fireworks display. During these strolls, Élisabeth attracts a lot of attention. It's at this time that two women, important for her future destiny, will cross her path.
The Duchess of Chartres, who you might say is her neighbor since she resides in the Palais Royal Gardens, will ask her to come and paint her portrait as well as that of her friends.
The Duchess of Chartres, future Duchess of Orléans, is a patron of the arts. It's she who will introduce the milliner and dressmaker Rose Bertin to Queen Marie Antoinette. The second meeting that will prove decisive for Élisabeth's future success will again take place during one of her strolls in a park.
We went to Marly-le-Roi, and there I realized for the first time how enchanting a place could be. One morning, I met the Queen walking in the park with several ladies of her court. They were all in white dresses and so young that they looked like an apparition. I was with my mother and was turning away to leave when the Queen very kindly stopped me and invited me to continue in any direction I might prefer.
Marie Antoinette had arrived in France in May 1770 at the age of 15 to marry Louis Auguste, Dauphin of France and grandson of Louis XV. During a firework display held to celebrate the marriage, Place Louis XV, future Place de la Concorde, is the scene of a dramatic incident. 133 people are smothered and trampled to death during a wave of panic caused by a fire set off by a falling rocket. An ominous omen, for it's on this very same site that 20 years later, the royal couple will be executed. Élisabeth and her family escape the fire unharmed. Élisabeth's clientele grows larger day by day, but she works as a free agent outside any official institution. The Gironde, a body governing professional incorporations, seizes her studio and obliges her to register her activity within a professional framework.
In 18th century France, it's obligatory to belong to an artists' guild. And in Paris, this was the Academy of St. Luke. So if you weren't a member of the Academy of St. Luke, you had to be a member of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture.
This is why she applies to become a member of the Academy of St. Luke, where she'll be enthusiastically accepted.
In 1775, Jacques-François Le Sèvre and his family moved to an apartment in a big mansion house in Rue de Cléry, almost directly opposite the former apartment of Louis Vigée.
Their apartment is in a beautiful mansion house called the Loubert Mansion, whose live-in owner is Jean-Baptiste Pierre Le Brun.
Jean-Baptiste is an ambitious young man who pursues a triple career as painter, art restorer, and art dealer. His apartments are filled with works of the old masters, which Élisabeth will study and copy.
The best learning method for aspiring female painters who'd already mastered the basics was to copy the existing works of art. It's always been like that.
Jean-Baptiste is also the curator of several large private art collections, such as that of the Count of Vaudreuil. Joseph Hyacinthe de Vaudreuil is a nobleman at the court of Louis XVI. Peer of France, governor of the Louvre, and member of the Academy of Fine Arts, he'll become one of the first collectors of Élisabeth's portraits. At the Loubert mansion, the young art dealer soon succumbs to the charms of the talented and beautiful young woman.
I was then 20 years old. I was living without anxiety as to my future, since I was earning a good deal of money and thus felt no inclination for matrimony. But my mother, who believed Monsieur Le Brun to be very rich, unceasingly urged me not to refuse such a profitable match, and I at last consented to the marriage.
They both have an artistic sensitivity. They can discuss painting, and they're both very ambitious. So it's this love of painting, this ambition, and a mutual attraction that will form the bond of their couple, which will last, finally, for quite a number of years.
Jean-Baptiste does business with the Dutch art dealers, and he takes the young woman with him on one of his trips to Flanders. In Antwerp, she discovers the masterpieces of Rubens. It's during this trip that the great master's technique inspires her to do a self-portrait on oak panel.
The use of oil on wood gives the painting a glossy, almost enamel effect, which is different to the effect produced by oil on canvas.
The panels are remarkable for the transparency of the coloration, which is surely a Rubensian effect, because it's very clear that she was very, very much influenced by Rubens.
She visits the Antwerp art dealer, Jean-Michel Van Ave, and discovers a portrait that's commonly known as the straw hat. It's actually a felt hat, which enables an effect of projected shadow, a play of light and shade, particularly on the face and forehead.
She went back to France and painted her self-portrait, which is one of the greatest pictures she ever painted, and the first one on panel. And she learned she acquired skill in painting with glazes, with colored glazes, and she's at the top of her form there.
The painting is so successful that Élisabeth, at the request of her clients, re-employs the same accessories. The silk shawl edged in black lace and the hat, creating a gentle chiaroscuro effect, can be found in several of her other portraits.
She'll use them to cover Madame du Barry, herself, Marie Antoinette, and many others. It's amusing to see that from one portrait to another, Vigée Le Brun, once she's found a formula that works, will use this same costume, these same accessories, on different models.
Although united through their shared love for painting and their ambition, Élisabeth and Jean-Baptiste live independent lives, and she'll describe her husband as a dissipated gambler who squanders all her money.
She speaks very badly of her husband in her memoirs, but I think her husband was very useful to her, in fact, not only by introducing her to great works of art, but also by his unfailing support of her.
Élisabeth nonetheless follows Jean-Baptiste's advice and sets up a painting atelier for young ladies. The young woman doesn't have much authority over her students, but transmits to them her love of art and her technique. Her young ladies' school, as Madame Le Brun calls it, will prove to be quite a success.
She had a group of young women around her who worked at her side and whom she taught. And one of the exercises she had them do was the expressive head study.
Not able to have live models in her atelier, Élisabeth gives her students her own drawings to copy as an exercise.
These are drawings done in black chalk with white chalk highlights. And we can see that she works as though she's using pastels. That is, she stomps her lines, probably with her fingertips. She smudges the black chalk to model the face, to create this shading that brings out the depth and volume. This is a very difficult exercise that each of her students has to learn how to do.
Shortly after opening her school, Élisabeth gives birth to her first child, a little girl that she'll name Julie, soon nicknamed Brunette. Added to the joy of being a mother is the satisfaction of becoming a recognized artist, whose fees are amongst the highest of her time.
Jean-Baptiste Pierre Le Brun, who knows the art market very well and who's an excellent businessman, knew what he was doing when he set extremely high prices for his wife's paintings.
An art dealer specializes in handling their artist in order to achieve the best result financially. But I have the impression that Vigée Le Brun was able to achieve the result financially on her own.
She's personable and talented enough to be able to establish her own connections.
Little by little, she's going to succeed in making a name for herself in the society of her time, on the one hand through her talent, and on the other through her beauty. She's a very graceful woman, very bright and cultivated.
While heads may turn to look at her in Paris, it's Élisabeth's conversation that particularly charms her models during sittings.
Another thing about painting portraits is that you have to be an intelligent person and a good conversationalist. People hated sitting for portraits. Members of the royal family hated it the most because they had to be painted the most. They wanted to be entertained when they sat.
Ambitious, her desire is to reach the highest ranks of power, and it's undoubtedly through the Duchess of Chartres that she gains access to Queen Marie Antoinette. In 1778, she obtains official entrance to the royal palace of Versailles.
Empress Maria Theresa, who was Marie Antoinette's mother, was never satisfied with any portrait of her daughter. She received some portraits that so offended her that she asked the Queen to find a painter.
Marie Antoinette est toujours déçue par les portraits.
Marie Antoinette is always disappointed with the portraits done of her. There's this famous letter to her mother in November 1774 in which she writes, "The painters kill me and make me despair."
So it's in this context of expectancy on the part of the Queen that Louise Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun is going to be given her chance at painting her, and it's this first portrait of the Queen called En robe à panier, in a hoop skirt.
Lorsqu'on regarde le visage de la reine,
when you look at the Queen's face in this portrait, it's still the Habsburg face. That is, the jutted-out chin, the thick bottom lip, the slightly protruding eyes. Then, progressively, she uses her talent to soften these physical defects, to create an image which, 10 years later, is that of this woman of great beauty, but which no longer exactly reflects reality.
The likenesses are perfect, and yet she operated like a plastic surgeon.
Élisabeth's true talent could be said to be that of adapting herself to the personality of her sitter. She's capable of bringing out the grace of the young noble ladies, the piquant lightness of the actress Madame Molé-Raymond, or the sensuality of Madame Grant, the future Princess of Talleyrand.
There's a lot of grace in Vigée Le Brun's portraits, and her texture is soft and velvety, in fact. There's a lot of sentiment there, rather than sentimentality. We feel she has empathy for her model.
Because she listens and observes, she knows how to bring out the natural attributes of her models.
It is difficult, however, to convey to anyone who has not seen the Queen an adequate idea of her noble traits and many graceful qualities. But the most remarkable thing about her face was the splendor of her complexion. I have never seen one so brilliant, and brilliant is the word, for her skin was so transparent that it had no shading. I was unable to reproduce its effect to my satisfaction. I had no colors to paint such freshness, such delicate tints, which were hers alone, and which I have never found in any other woman.
Marie Antoinette has found her portraitist. While not actually being close friends, A steady relationship of affectionate intimacy established itself between the two women.
Marie Antoinette shares her passion for the opera with the portraitist, and the sittings often end with the two of them performing in a duet the fashionable tunes of the time. Élisabeth now wants the ultimate recognition, that of being accepted by the Royal Academy of Painting. But she's refused admission because its regulations formally forbid any contact with mercantile professions, and she's the wife of an art dealer.
A woman at that time shared the profession of her husband. So that was the reason they excluded her. And so she went behind their backs and went to the Queen and persuaded the Queen to get permission from the King for her to be able to enter the Academy, because that was the royal way to succeed. Then you could exhibit in the official Salon of the Academy.
In reality, the Academy accepts very few women artists. Only 4 of them will be admitted in 1783, Madame Le Brun, Anne Vallier-Coster, Marie-Thérèse Reboul, and a formidable rival in the art of portraiture, Adelaide Labille-Guiard.
She and her great rival, Madame Labille-Guiard, used to show their finest works in the Salon, and each of them tried to beat the other one. So in 1783, Vigée Le Brun did her self-portrait wearing a straw hat, which is one of the great masterpieces of her. Then very next Salon, Madame Labille-Guiard produced her self-portrait with her students. So she was trying to show off and to put herself on the same level as her rival.
Madame Vigée Le Brun, who was extremely ambitious, ardently wanted to attain the higher hierarchy of painting, which was history painting.
Among the history painters, Jacques-Louis David, member of the Royal Academy, is the uncontested master. He will achieve fame in 1784 with his famous painting Oath of the Horatii, which will eclipse his rivals. He'll be a precious friend and advisor to Élisabeth.
She always wanted to be a history painter. In the scale of the genres, history painting was at the very top, and portraiture came had a much lower standing.
In the 18th century, anatomy is a domain strictly reserved for men. The rule for women is not to see a nude body, not to be in the presence of a nude body.
If you couldn't draw from the male nude, you couldn't paint history, you couldn't paint mythology. Essentially, you couldn't rise to the highest plane in the arts, so you were permanently handicapped.
Madame Vigée Le Brun gets through thanks to the helping hand of her royal connections, and impudently flirts with the history painting genre through the work she presents as her reception piece, Peace Bringing Back Prosperity.
We can see in this her desire to be a history painter, but using female models, so remaining within the limits of decency.
But while women may know a certain success as artists, they're limited to the minor arts, which are the miniature, the portrait, or still life.
What's always interesting with these still lifes is that these women are sending a hidden message.
Anne Vallier-Coster is an artist specialized in this static world that is still life, one of the compositions of which hides a very distinctive signature.
Of a horrible press campaign against her. Because she belonged to the circle who formed the most intimate friendships with the court of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and she became the official or rather the non-official first painter to the Queen.
Elizabeth is likened to the much criticized Queen, who's accused of being clannish, of spending extravagantly, and of disregarding court etiquette.
Marie Antoinette breaches court etiquette by choosing her own dressmakers, which theoretically she doesn't have the right to do. But she overrides this rule, and this is why she favors Rose Bertin, as well as other dressmakers, and why she also favors Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. She's really the protector of both these women.
This female trio, represented by Marie Antoinette, Rose Bertin, and the portraitist, will become the model for Parisian taste. Elizabeth, for her part, spends very little on her wardrobe and invents a simple and practical dress style that's suited to her work. Leaving aside wigs, hoops, and adornments, she wears white cotton blouses and comfortable skirts that she embellishes with a colored belt. Soon, ladies of the court and Parisian women will want to emulate her style of dress.
She explains that she wants to change the fashion codes and move more towards simplicity. She relates that she's the first one not to use powder on her models, to have natural-looking hair in her portraits. All this takes place in a historical context, the 1780s, influenced by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his natural man philosophy.
Madame Le Brun, always on the lookout for new clients, knows that the Salon of the Royal Academy, a veritable contemporary art fair, is the place to be seen at. She exhibits her portraits there at each session.
The art salon is indispensable. You have to show yourself. And this is something that Vigée Le Brun excels at, because not only is she a woman artist, she's also a businesswoman, a strategist, who pursues her career in a very independent way and who understood marketing ahead of her time.
Élisabeth and Marie Antoinette mutually enhance each other. The artist simplifies the look of her royal model and beautifies it. But this simplification has its limits, and for the Salon of 1783, she'll propose a quite unexpected picture of the Queen.
We know the story of the famous muslin dress portrait, in which Marie Antoinette wears a simple English-style dress, where the Queen progressively agrees to discard her heavy, stiff gowns and be represented in a much simpler manner.
This muslin dress, which is a simple cotton muslin dress, places the spotlight on a material, cotton, that's normally used for underwear or for a house dress at the most. So it's particularly audacious on the part of Vigée Le Brun to present a portrait of Marie Antoinette dressed in a muslin dress in 1783, because this is the first salon where she's exhibiting, and she's taking an enormous risk. A risk she doesn't entirely assume, however, because a few days later, because of the scandal it provoked, she withdraws the painting and replaces it with an identical portrait, but with the Queen wearing a much more conventional dress.
Despite the scandal provoked by the portrait, Marie Antoinette's faith in her portraitist remains unshaken. She'll commission other portraits from her, and soon one of her children, too.
We have to place ourselves in the context. A few years after their marriage, the royal couple's infertility becomes an affair of state, so much so that the arrival of Madame Royale, Mary Theresa Charlotte, is a cause for national celebration. And then the birth of the Dauphin, Louis-Joseph Xavier François, sends the country into raptures of joy, since there's now a male heir to the throne, ensuring dynastic continuity. Madame Le Brun is going to place them in a pastoral setting, with the royal children sitting on the ground. This is not at all in keeping with court etiquette, and yet their costume still reminds us of the rank of Marie Antoinette's children, since the heir apparent wears the insignia and the celestial blue ribbon of the Order of the Holy Spirit, which all children of the sovereign receive on the day of their baptism. Madame Vigée Le Brun will find the model for this painting in a work by one of her elders, François Hubert Drouet, called Comte d'Artois and Madame Clotilde. They are the brother and sister of Louis XVI.
Et la sœur de Louis XVI.
Pregnant again, Élisabeth loses her second child, aged only a few months. She transfers all her affection to Julie. In the tradition of the virgins of Raphael, whom she admires, she paints herself with her arms around her daughter, an expression of maternal tenderness on her face.
In 1787, she paints herself with her daughter in a self-portrait that the critics are immediately going to name maternal tenderness, this gentle affection of the soul. And this portrait will be unanimously applauded at the Salon. It's true, it does give off a particularly harmonious image of the mother-child relationship. And it's this sort of ideal, symbiotic image that the artist will try to preserve, and which will be destroyed by the reality of her true relationship with her daughter.
King Louis XVI, and especially Marie Antoinette, are the target of increasingly aggressive criticisms and satirical cartoons. Discontent is brewing, and what should have remained just an anecdote in 1785 becomes a scandal. The jewelers Baumer and Bassange had in their safes since 1772 a fabulous 2,800-carat diamond necklace intended for Madame du Barry. Louis XV dies before the necklace is delivered. The jewelers offer it on two separate occasions to Marie Antoinette, who refuses it. The Countess de la Motte concocts an extraordinary plan to steal the necklace, compromising the Queen. When the affair comes to light, the Countess is arrested and branded with V for voleur, meaning thief. The necklace was never found. The pamphleteers picked up the story of the affair of the necklace and refused to believe in Marie Antoinette's innocence. This scandal destroys what's left of the Queen's reputation in the eyes of the public, who now accuse her of all kinds of wrongs.
This is why the superintendent of the King's buildings, Dangeviller, is going to commission from the artist a portrait of the Queen as a mother with her children.
It's at a time when the Queen is extremely unpopular. She's referred to as the Austrian. There's this famous necklace affair, so it's really in the aim of rehabilitating Marie Antoinette, to have people forget the frivolous young woman she may have been and rehabilitate her through exalting her in her role as mother. So it's a highly political commission.
It's a group portrait, a composition that the artist isn't particularly used to doing, and it's also a very large format portrait, so she's going to ask David for advice.
He suggests a triangular composition in order to sanctify the painting and bring to mind the compositions of the Renaissance, and in particular, Raphael's Holy Families.
Exhibited in the Salon of 1787 between the portrait of Julie and her mother and a portrait of Madame Adelaide by Labille-Guiard, the painting could almost allude to an episode of Roman history, that of Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi. A friend who'd come to visit Cornelia and show off her jewelry asked to see Cornelia's in turn. Cornelia replies by gesturing to her children, "These are my treasures and my finest jewels."
That's why we see in this highly composed painting Queen Marie Antoinette with her children, and behind them the Queen's jewel case. The jewel case is relegated to the background, and it's her children that are placed in the foreground. Placed on the jewel case is the royal crown resting on a cushion decorated with fleur-de-lis to remind us of the majestic dignity of the characters. We're still in a royal context. Now this jewel case, even if it is in the shadows, can't help bringing to mind the recent affair of the necklace, so it's perhaps because of this that the painting fails in its purpose. Everyone sees the portrait. It's heavily criticized, especially for the expression on the Queen's face, which is deemed to be too sad.
It's far too late for Marie Antoinette's reputation to be restored.
These scandals don't make a dent in Madame Le Brun's artistic and social successes. Her little antechamber has become a very popular salon in Paris, where celebrities can be counted amongst the painters, poets, and fashionable musicians.
Anyone who was anyone in Paris, in music, came to her salon. So who were these people? Well, there was Gluck. Gluck is a star in France. Since his arrival at the Paris Opera House, he received lots of commissions. He wrote 6 great operas for Paris. Grétry came to her salon, she sang with him, and Grétry was also a European celebrity.
Everyone came to her. She put on very, very fine entertainments at home.
In a constant spirit of creativity, Élisabeth lends support to a movement that will be very popular up until the beginning of the 19th century, the return to the antique style.
I will now give you, my dear friend, the exact account of the most brilliant supper I ever gave in the days when people were always talking about my luxurious and magnificent way of life.
While she rests, her brother would read her poems or books. And that day, he reads her an excerpt from a novel by the Abbot Barthélemy describing an antique-style dinner.
One evening, when I had invited a dozen or more friends to hear a recital by the poet Le Brun, my brother read aloud to me a few pages of the Travels of a Narcissus during my rest. When he came to the passage where, in the description of a Greek dinner, the method of preparing various sauces is explained, he said we ought to try this tonight. I sent immediately for my cook and gave her the necessary instructions for the preparation of a certain sauce for the fowl and of another for the eel. My atelier, full of things I used for draping my models, would furnish me with enough material for garments. I placed behind the chairs a large screen, which I took the precaution of concealing beneath some hangings looped up at intervals, as may be seen in Poussin's pictures. As I was expecting some very beautiful women, I thought it a good idea to dress everybody in Greek costumes, in order to have a surprise ready for Monsieur de Vaudreuil, who was not expected till 10 o'clock. As I always wore white gowns in the form of a tunic, I needed only to put a chaplet of flowers on my head. The preparations were finished. I took particular pains in costuming my daughter, darling child that she was.
The guests start to arrive. Madame de Bonneuil, Madame Chalgrin. She dresses them up in drapings from her studio, wraps scarves and shawls around their waists.
And there they were, all 3 metamorphosed into perfect Athenians. Le Brun Pindar comes in, and I fix on his head a crown of laurels. At 10 o'clock, we heard the carriage of Count de Vaudreuil enter the courtyard. He was so surprised and delighted that he stood motionless for a long time before making up his mind to take the seat we had reserved for him. I do not believe I have ever spent a more amusing evening. Monsieur de Vaudreuil was so delighted with the evening that he talked about it to all his acquaintances the next day. Some ladies of the court begged me to repeat the performance. I declined for various reasons, whereat several of the ladies took offense.
If the name of Count Vaudreuil is so often mentioned in Madame Le Brun's memoirs, it's because their relationship may have been less platonic than she describes it.
She probably had a liaison with Count Vaudreuil. In any case, her gardener notes in his diary that Madame Le Brun was Vaudreuil's mistress. Madame Le Brun possessed among her objects a snuff box which had a lock of Vaudreuil's hair inlaid in its lid. There exists a regular correspondence between them. This correspondence was burnt during the Reign of Terror by Étienne Vigée for safety's sake. But the fact that this correspondence existed gives us a clue.
Since the end of the 1780s, bad harvests and ever heavier taxes weaken and discontent the population. Revolts break out. To find a solution to the financial crisis, the king convokes a meeting of the Estates General. On June the 20th, 1789, in the Jeu de Paume room at Versailles, the deputies of the Third Estate, the clergy and the nobility take an oath not to adjourn before adopting a constitution for France. On June the 30th, the people of Paris storm the prison of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and free the French guards imprisoned there for insubordination. On the morning of July the 14th, the Parisian rioters go looking for arms. They pillage the arsenal of the Hôtel des Invalides and the royal treasury, where they find guns and cannons, but no powder. They'll find some at the Bastille, together with other partisans of the revolution amassed in front of the fortress prison in Faubourg Saint-Antoine since that morning. The storming and destruction of the Bastille, symbol of arbitrary power, begins.
An atmosphere of insecurity spreads through Paris, and Louise Elizabeth feels herself in danger. Inscriptions are scrawled on the newly renovated walls of the Le Brun mansion. She can no longer show herself at the window.
A new municipal administration is going to be set up. Louis XVI goes to Paris on July the 17th and agrees to wear pinned to his hat the tricolour cockade, a combination of blue and red, the colours of Paris, with the royal white. During the night of August the 4th, 1789, the Assembly abolishes aristocratic privilege. The society of the old order is living its final moments.
Louise Elizabeth, who doesn't want to stay at the Le Brun house, goes to Louvciennes, where she's promised Madame du Barry, the former favorite of Louis XV, to paint her portrait. She finds a moment of peace in this setting, where she admires the view of the Seine hillsides.
At Louvciennes, time seems to have stood still. But the peace is deceptive. Paris is under siege, and violent rioting rages day and night in the suburbs.
From Louvciennes, we could hear cannon fire in the distance. And I remember the poor woman saying, if Louis XV were alive, none of this would be happening.
Élisabeth knows that she has to leave France.
It's effectively the moment for her to go into exile. She waited, however, until October before leaving, unlike Count Artois, who left on July the 14th.
On October the 5th, 1789, a crowd, mainly women, makes its way towards Versailles. The king receives a delegation. But at break of day on October the 6th, the horde storms the palace, killing several guards. To calm the situation, Louis agrees to go with his family to the Tuileries Palace. They're escorted through an angry, vociferous crowd. The heads of guards are brandished on pikes. For Elizabeth, flight is now inevitable.
By a strange coincidence, she'll take the stagecoach the day after the royal family is led from Versailles to the town hall, then to the Tuileries.
That night, disguised as working women, Élisabeth, Brunette, and her governess climb into the stagecoach. Her brother Etienne, Jean-Baptiste Le Brun, and their friend Hubert Robert ride at the side of the coach up to the Saint-Antoine barrier. The first stage of the journey will take Élisabeth to Lyon. She doesn't know it yet, but this journey will last 13 years. 13 years of exile throughout Europe. Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun left Paris with very little luggage and just enough money to pay her fare to Rome, hoping she would not be recognized. and could pass the border without mishap.
Opposite me in the stagecoach was a man who told me quite simply that he had stolen watches and other things. Not satisfied with relating his fine exploits to us, the thief talked incessantly of stringing up such and such people on lampposts, naming a number of my own acquaintances. My daughter thought this man very wicked. He frightened her. And this gave me the courage to say, "I beg you, sir, not to talk of killing before this child." That silenced him, and he ended by playing at battle with my daughter.
After a stop in Lyon, the traveler then reached Chambéry in the state of Savoie. Once outside of France, she finally felt safe. But she was recognized by a postilion while she crossed the Mont-Cenis Pass, and simply because he'd seen an engraving of her self-portrait with her daughter. Madame Le Brun's celebrity had been fueled by the spread throughout Europe of engravings of her most famous portraits. Reassured for a while, she continued on her way to Rome.
The young woman decided to leave on what would appear like a study trip to Italy. The Grand Tour in Italy was a rite of passage for painters. So off she went, leaving her husband, but taking her daughter.
In the late 18th century, travel was fashionable. Exiles, traders, and artists in search of patrons crisscrossed Europe in stagecoaches, cabs, and carriages. New roads and repairs to old roads were shortening travel time. In 1750, it took 12 days to cross France, whereas 15 years later, 8 sufficed. In 1780, the public coaches were still twice as fast on the royal roads, while the invention of spring suspension eased the traveler's tiredness. Fresh horses awaited riders and carriages at post houses in order to accelerate mail delivery. Here, inns would cater to travelers' appetites and sometimes provide basic accommodation. Since the 17th century, Rome had been the homeland of all European artists. The circulation of the paintings of Italian artists and the creation of large collections ensured that the whole of Europe was familiar with the works of the masters. The Grand Tour, as it was called, was a study trip not just for artists, but also for young gentlemen keen to round out their education. Italian landscapes were in fashion at the time. In France, Joseph Vernet romanticized Naples and Rome, whereas Hubert Robert specialized in depicting ancient Roman ruins.
The artist did break her journey, first in Turin, then in Parma. Finally, she traveled to Bologna, where she stayed for some time.
In this town, the first thing the young woman wanted to see was a picture she'd heard of by Domenichino, The Martyrdom of St. Agnes. Soon after her arrival, she was gazing at the painting at length, moved by the youth and innocence of the young martyr. Suddenly, the organ struck up the overture to Iphigénie en Tauride, one of Marie Antoinette's favorite arias. Saint Iphigénie and the Queen merged into one tragic image. The traveler burst into tears. A flood of memories of happy, light-hearted times that seemed forever lost, and for the first time, she deeply felt the solitude of exile. From Bologna, she journeyed to Florence, where she decided to linger. In the Uffizi Gallery, enriched by the Medicis, she explored the masterpieces of Michelangelo, Titian, Raphael, and in the Palazzo Pitti, those of Rubens and Rembrandt. For a time, the wealth of wonders made her forget Paris and the Revolution, and she set off once more for Rome, spiritual home of all artists.
You know, dear friend, that just a short distance from Rome, St. Peter's Dome is visible? I cannot tell you the joy I felt upon seeing it. I thought I was dreaming of what I had so long desired in vain. Only the satisfaction of living in Rome could soothe my sorrow at leaving my land, my family, and so many beloved friends.
Upon her arrival, the portraitist was taken in by her friend, the painter Menageot, director of the French Academy. He lent her a little money.
Menageot admired her greatly, and she loved to hear him talk about painting. It's possible that a platonic relationship developed between them.
Founded in 1666 by Colbert and later installed in the Palazzo Mancini, the Academy welcomed pensionnaires chosen by the Académie Royale. Her fame had crossed borders, and orders from exiled emigrants and Italian nobles came flooding in. She was even invited by the Vatican to execute a portrait of Pope Pius VI. Élisabeth refused the commission, as custom would have insisted on her being veiled for the sittings, which she saw as incompatible with the quality of her work.
When she arrived in Rome, she came across an already established female painter even more successful than herself, Angelica Kaufman.
Like Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun, Angelica Kaufman was a precocious artist. Born in Switzerland, also into a family of painters, she traveled throughout Europe at a young age, acquiring a cosmopolitan clientele. In London, she was one of the founders of the Royal Academy, and her portraits were sought after among the gentry.
Angelica Kaufman has a rather different background. She started out an international artist. She had a father who was a journeyman painter. She was in fact, a history painter a good part of her life. And that's one of the great differences between the two of them. And she was traveling all over Switzerland and North Italy when she was very young. I dare say, was a more international artist than Vigée Le Brun.
In her memoirs, Madame Vigée Le Brun speaks of Angelica Kaufman, saying she was very intelligent and that what she did was pretty. You could sense she didn't want to say she was a good painter. She just said she was very cultured, but rather boring.
Despite the unfavorable review, Élisabeth was flattered to appear at the theater or the opera alongside the most famous of her colleagues.
She was thrilled that all the spectators finally acclaimed them as the two most famous female artists in Europe.
Though the male-written history books may have forgotten their names, great museums and international collectors have fought over the masterpieces of Rosalba Carriera, Angelica Kaufman, Adelaide Labille-Guiard, and Élisabeth Vigée Le Brun. Female painters were prisoners of their category, but some, such as Marie-Guillemine Benoit, did break free. Despite the critics, Élisabeth's former pupil launched herself into genre painting, like this portrait of a black woman, which would become a symbol of the emancipation of slaves and of feminism.
You get the impression there were very few women painters or artists, and that the men far outnumbered them. But you gradually realize that there really were quite a few, but they were kept in the shade and forced into the background in regard to the men.
Noting that lots of foreigners were leaving to spend the summer in Naples, Élisabeth decided to go there after spending several months in Rome.
We reached Naples at about 3 or 4 o'clock. I cannot describe the impression I received upon entering the town. That burning sun, that stretch of sea, those islands seen in the distance, that Vesuvius with a great column of smoke ascending from it. I was enchanted by all of it.
In Naples, one of the first people she got to know was Lord Hamilton, in whose entourage was the famous Lady Hamilton, or rather the soon-to-be Lady Hamilton, whom the artist painted many times. Owing to her extraordinary physique, she was already sitting for Reynolds, and her likenesses were well known throughout Europe.
Emma Hart, the future Lady Hamilton, began her career in a London tavern. Thanks to her astonishing beauty, she found, with several English gentlemen, the protection she required. Despite her scandalous reputation, Emma managed in 1791 to wed Lord Hamilton, British ambassador to Naples. The portrait of her as Sibyl would be used by Elizabeth as a reference work to acquire new clients.
This portrait would be very important in her career. She carried it with her, and at each stage of her European tour would unroll it, pin it in a frame, and thus advertise her talent. In Naples, she was soon introduced to the royal family, more particularly to Marie Caroline, who was Marie Antoinette's elder sister.
Élisabeth was very moved by the striking resemblance between the two sisters and painted a portrait of Marie Caroline in virtually the same pose as Marie Antoinette. Of this fine portrait, only copies remain. One morning in the summer of 1790, French ambassador Baron de Talleyrand brought her a commission from the Queen of Naples, that of the portrait of her two daughters, whom she sought to marry.
The hour of noon was appointed for the sittings, and to attend, I was obliged to follow the Chioggia road in the heat of the day. The sun's reflection was so vivid that I was almost struck blind. To save my eyes, I put on a green veil, which I had never seen anyone else do, and which must have looked rather peculiar since only black or white veils were worn. But a few days after, I saw several English women imitating me, and green veils came into fashion.
The fashion was launched, and with a hint of vanity, she boasted of inventing a style that other women adopted. Though a pioneer of fashion abroad, she didn't want to be forgotten in France. So using Menageot as go-between, she sent off a portrait to the Salon du Louvre.
For the 1791 Salon, she sent, rolled in a painting by Menageot, her portrait of Paisiello, the musician, a magnificent portrait which was exhibited with the paintings of David, etc.
She painted him in 1790 in a moment of inspiration. His eyes were raised heavenward, he was composing on the harpsichord and seemed to be seeking divine inspiration. It's a recurrent image in Madame Vigée Le Brun's body of work. She also painted Angelica Catalani, a soprano, one of Paisiello's artists, also in this attitude of divine inspiration.
While Elizabeth was persona non grata in France, her rival Adelaide Labille-Guiard, who rallied to the revolutionary cause, portrayed Robespierre and his friends, thus attempting to ensure the support of the new strongmen in Paris. Back in Rome, Madame Vigée Le Brun returned to her friend François Menageot and set to work once more. Two daughters of Louis XV, Madame Adelaide and Madame Victoire, both in exile, called her and during a sitting informed her of some tragic news. In the night of June the 21st, 1791, the royal family left the Tuileries Palace in secret and took a coach bound for Lorraine towards the French troops that had remained loyal to the king. Traveling with fake passports, the runaways were nonetheless recognized in Varennes and taken back to Paris by the National Guard. The royal escape was viewed as a betrayal of the Constitution. The idea of a republic was gaining ground, and supporters of the abolition of the monarchy used this event to accuse Louis XVI of rallying to France's enemies.
The artist had planned to return to France after a 3-year stay in Italy.
On the way, she lingered in Tuscany, where her love of nature was matched by the richness of the landscapes. She made a visit to Venice, where she was charmed by its architecture on wooden piles, and by the many parties she attended with a writer and engraver friend, also a refugee, Dominique Vivant-Denon, who had fun making an engraving of her self-portrait. Keen to return to France, Elizabeth headed for Turin. But the city was filled with émigrés fleeing the bloody massacres in Paris from September the 2nd to the 7th, 1792.
On entering the town, great heavens, streets, squares were all filled with thousands of people of all ages who had fled from French towns and come to Turin in search of a home. The sight broke my heart. Trembling, I dared only ask for news of my mother, my brother, Monsieur Le Brun, and all my friends, and abandoned the plan of going to Paris.
The young woman realized that she couldn't return to France. Shattered, she turned back towards Milan. She was advised by Count Wilczek, Austrian ambassador to Milan, and decided to win over a new clientele in Vienna. Élisabeth entered the Holy Roman capital in summer 1792, and there she stayed for 3 years.
Her time was split between concerts, melancholy strolls in Schönbrunn, and, of course, the production of paintings for all the Poles and the diplomats in Vienna.
I worked a great deal in Vienna. It would be difficult to express all the gratitude I felt for the reception I was afforded in this town. Not only did the Viennese express their affection for me personally, they thought it stylish to place my paintings in a way that set them off best.
Élisabeth was a perfect colorist who had learned to grind pigments into powder by binding them with various raw or cooked oils. She claimed that these preparations were the secret of her color's freshness. But the quick-drying paint had to be used immediately. Not until 1841 did the revolutionary tinfoil tube of paint allow painters to carry their already prepared colors. Viewed as an immigrant, Madame Vigée Le Brun lost her citizens' rights. In 1793, her husband published a long plea that his wife be permitted to return to Paris. A petition signed by 255 artists was handed to the authorities, to no avail. Le Brun was arrested and incarcerated for several months, as was Élisabeth's brother Etienne. Le Brun, to protect himself and to preserve their assets, filed for divorce, which was granted in 1794. In Vienna, she was glad to find the Comte de Vaudreuil, whose closeness to the court had forced him into exile in 1789. But the pleasure of their meeting was soon overshadowed by echoes of the terror. In early 1793, devastating news spread across Europe.
I thus heard of the horrible occurrence through my brother, who wrote it down and sent the letter without giving any further particulars whatever. His heart broken, he simply wrote that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had perished on the scaffold. Afterward, from compassion toward myself, I always abstained from putting the least question concerning what accompanied or preceded that awful murder. King, queen, friend. I lost all of them.
Élisabeth listened to the Russian ambassador's suggestion that there was a new wealthy clientele to be found. Despite the distance and the risks of such a journey, she decided to try her hand in St. Petersburg.
She left Vienna with a few letters of recommendation and a passport, and a stage-by-stage itinerary.
Berlin, Dresden, Potsdam, Rheinsberg, where she stayed with Prince Henry of Prussia, brother to the king, Königsberg, Riga, and finally St. Petersburg. 3,000 kilometers of exhausting, sometimes dangerous roads. Élisabeth and Brunette moved into an apartment located on the main Winter Palace Square. From her windows, she could gaze upon the splendor of the imperial residence and the nobility of the angles described by the avenues that opened up before her.
She arrived in summer 95, the end of Catherine the Great's reign. It was a time when all French immigrants looked upon Russia as the new land of Renaissance. Back then, revolution was a constant. All the kings were engaged in wars, and the two countries where peace reigned were Russia and the United States of America, the New World.
Sophie Friederike August, the future Catherine the Great, was the daughter of German Prince Christian August von Anhalt-Zerbst. At 15, she married the future Peter III of Russia. Immature and unstable, Peter was overthrown 6 months into his reign by a coup d'etat organized by his wife, and was strangled several days later, no doubt by her lover, Count Grigory Orlov. French-speaking and extremely cultured, Catherine became sovereign empress and reigned for more than 30 years. 2 days after her arrival in St. Petersburg, Madame Vigée was officially summoned to an audience with the Tsarina. Perhaps too sure of her standing as an international artist, and wearing a simple white tunic unsuited to the situation, she forgot the ceremonial kissing of the hand and simply bowed without kneeling to the Empress. This hiccup in protocol was considered offensive by the imperial courtiers, who became hostile to the portraitist. Despite that, her celebrity as Marie Antoinette's painter kindled the interest and curiosity of the St. Petersburg nobility.
Madame Le Brun was particularly touched by the welcome bestowed on her by the Russian nobility. Princess Dolgorakaya invited her for a week to her dacha, where she made the acquaintance of someone who was to be very important to her, Princess Korokina, who would later be the dedicatee of her memoirs and an extremely loyal friend.
All the young ladies of the Russian nobility spoke French, and they warmly welcomed this ambassador of fashion, taste, and French customs.
In the 18th century, all Russians had to make a pilgrimage to Paris, not for studies, obviously. In Paris, they would learn how to dress, to speak, even how to cough, blow one's nose, and wear a hat properly. In short, to become a perfect Parisian.
Though her famous Greek supper made headlines in France in 1789, her reputation for high living crossed borders. In St. Petersburg, they still talk of a party costing £40,000, the equivalent of 400,000 euros, whereas Elizabeth speaks only of £15. She dressed her models in the Greek style, significant in Russia, and that she herself claimed to have made fashionable.
The artist was able to create for herself a certain dress style, expressed in such a way that her charm and the attraction she exerted over her circle encouraged the desire to imitate her.
The mid-18th century witnessed an explosion of Grecomania, with the spread of engravings that reproduced frescoes found in Pompeii and Herculaneum. Even the revolutionary celebrations were inspired by antiquity.
Previously, the child wasn't really thought of as a person. They weren't even sure whether it had a soul. This idea of a child as a person in their own right gradually led to more and more family portraits.
The Empress, who loved her two granddaughters, the Archduchesses Eleanor and Alexandra, placed an order for their portrait. Elizabeth painted them as rather languid, in an atmosphere of innocence, with bare arms.
And Catherine took great offense at that. And she complained about it, and Vigée Le Brun had to scrape it off the canvas and start all over again.
It just would not do. Even the portrait of these little girls had to embody the power of the nation, as she herself embodied the strength of the world's greatest empire.
It was during this same period that she met Stanislas Poniatowski, deposed King of Poland, then under house arrest in St. Petersburg. Sent by his uncle to Russia, Stanislas benefited from the protection of Catherine the Great, who became besotted with the young man and had him restored to the Polish throne. He was the last king of an independent Poland.
She told an anecdote. One day when she was painting, he came to her workshop and she called out, "I'm not at home." The king left. She then realized how bold she had been, and in turn went to see him to proffer her excuses. He told her he quite understood how a very busy artist shouldn't be disturbed, and wasn't at all angry. And there we have an insight into the character of this man she particularly liked. She painted a very flattering portrait of him in words. Stanislas was tall, gentle, kind, etc. You can tell that theirs was a beautiful friendship.
Despite her mother's wishes to the contrary, Brunette was determined to marry a young impecunious secretary from St. Petersburg of Italian origin, Gaetano Nigris. The rows became increasingly violent. Madame Le Brun gave in to her daughter and obtained her husband's consent to Julie's marriage.
Owing to the distance, her father's answer was long delayed, and someone convinced her that I had only written to Monsieur Le Brun to prevent him from assenting to what she called her felicity. She said to me one day, "I post your letters, but I am sure you write others to the contrary." I was stunned and heartbroken. When at that very moment, the postman arrived with a letter from Monsieur Le Brun giving his consent. But the cruel child showed not the least gratitude at what I had done for her in immolating all my wishes, hopes, and dislikes. The wedding was nevertheless enacted a few days later.
After almost 7 years in Russia, Madame Vigée, tempted to settle in St. Petersburg for good, bitterly faced the facts.
Towards the end of her stay, orders were fewer than at the beginning, because in fact, there weren't ever that many prospective clients.
The breakup with Julie was complete. Mother and daughter no longer spoke to one another. She held no official position, her clientele was becoming scarcer, and she had to go to Moscow to consolidate her fortune. Her health deteriorated, and she became prone to fits of melancholy. In June 1800, she learned that she had been removed from the list of émigrés, meaning that nothing stood in the way of her return to France. Despite regrets, as she thought of Russia as her second home, she made up her mind to return to Paris.
She returned to France alone and was amazed how much the smiling, pleasant landscapes of her outward journey now seemed dull, sad, and melancholy. A landscape is a state of the soul, she would say. So for her, it was a sad return.
After a long and arduous trip, Élisabeth entered the capital with a heavy heart on January the 18th, 1802. Jean-Baptiste was waiting for her on the steps of the Hôtel Libert. Despite their divorce, the emotion was palpable. That night, he made a laconic entry in his notebook. Arrival in Paris of Madame Vigée. Her absence, from her departure on October the 6th to January the 18th, 1802, lasted 12 years, 3 months, and 12 days.
She realized that the world had changed. She could not get used to Parisian life, to French life. Customs had changed. It was no longer the society she had known.
After the coup d'etat of November the 9th, 1799, which overthrew the French Directory, the Constitution of the year 8 established an authoritarian political regime headed by First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant general swept to prominence by the success of his campaigns in Italy and Egypt. 5 years later, in 1804, Bonaparte declared himself emperor of the French people and became Napoleon I. A new nobility was established in the mansions of Paris. But Madame Le Brun, devoted to the Bourbons and the Ancien Régime, couldn't get used to their ways and displayed a hostility that soon displeased the new emperor.
She stays in Paris just a short time, and she fulfills several commissions she had received while she was in Russia, and she made pastel studies of certain people that she produced oil portraits of and then sent them back to Russia and to Germany.
In late 1802, Madame Vigée announced her intention to take a 2-year trip to England in the hope of finding a new clientele.
She picked up her brushes and her paint box and traveled to London.
At the time, England boasted some 800 portraitists. Competition was fierce, and the artist's extremely expensive fees tended to work against her.
Very soon, Madame Vigée Le Brun stepped back from English society, which she found profoundly dull and monotonous, and said, "I am not surprised English adopted the word spleen. Your mirth equates to our boredom."
A cabal headed by the painter Hoppner didn't help her status as a foreigner in the Kingdom of Great Britain.
Hoppner never got anywhere near the prices that she got. So he was very, very upset. And he was something of a poet, so he wrote a poem. And he really gives her, you know, like we say here, he gives her what for.
As the emperor wished to portray the members of his dynasty, Madame Vigée, in Paris once more, received an official commission for the portrait of his sister Caroline, Princess Murat. The artist, unable to refuse, grudgingly did her duty. The thoughtless Caroline's repeated lateness for her sittings exasperated the portraitist, who observed, "I have painted real princesses who never worried me and never made me wait." In the summer of 1807, Paris was invaded by a stifling heat. Madame Vigée bowed to the Alpine fashion and organized a trip to Switzerland.
Twice, in 1807 and 1808, she travels a different circuit through Switzerland.
On this occasion, she stayed with Madame de Staël. Germaine de Staël was living in semi-exile in the Château de Copé. The literary and philosophical salon she held in Paris had aroused the suspicions of the emperor, who forbade her from re-entering France. Élisabeth and Madame de Staël shared a love of the arts and a hostility towards Napoleon. The author of Corinne ou l'Italie and the portraitist were two illustrious women, defenders of the Ancien Régime and totally independent. On April 3, 1814, the Senate proclaimed the deposition of Napoleon. Charles, Count of Artois and brother of Louis XVI, preceded his brother, the future Louis XVIII, and made a triumphant entrance into Paris on April 12th. Loyal royalist Madame Le Brun left her house in Louveciennes and hastened to the capital, where she cried tears of joy for the restoration of the Bourbons. But her happiness was short-lived, shattered by news of her daughter Brunette, who had separated from her husband and was living in a modest boarding house in Paris. She was slowly sinking into poverty. The links between mother and daughter had weakened. Destroyed by drink and occasional prostitution, Julie had contracted syphilis. Informed of her plight, Madame Le Brun hurried to her bedside.
I hastened to her as soon as I heard of her illness. But the disease progressed rapidly, and I cannot tell what I felt when all hope of saving her was gone. When going to see her the last day, my eyes fell upon that dreadfully sunken face. I fainted away. The next day I was childless. I saw her again. I still see her in the days of her childhood. Alas, she was so young. Why did she not survive me?
Madame Le Brun didn't understand what mistakes she'd made with Julie. Didn't she try to pass on her passion for painting? Closeness turned to incomprehension, and then into violent disputes. The independent young woman couldn't find her place alongside her too talented, too famous mother. Madame Le Brun looked to her nieces for comfort and passed on to them her precious advice on portrait painting.
It is interesting to note just how much, when you look at this work and read the advice she gives to Eugénie Tripier-Le-Franc, her counsel mirrors her execution. She says, the shadows must be both strong and transparent, not thickened, and in a mature tone, accompanied by firm, lively touches in the cavities, such as the eye socket, the recess of the nostrils, and the shadowy internal parts of the ear. And it's true that when you come closer and study the recess of the eye, you have a whole series of strokes in red and black chalk that provide the eyes with their shadow.
It seems to me that as a technical artist, Vigée Le Brun is extremely gifted. For a woman who did not have formal training, she is an impeccable technician. And one of the things about her works is that if they haven't been interfered with or suffered some accidental damage, they're likely to be in an extremely good state of preservation. She must have known a lot about color, because you rarely see any of these discolorations which are caused by alterations in the material.
France underwent another revolution, the July Revolution of 1830. The people of Paris rose up against the authority of Charles X, barricaded the streets, and clashed with the armed forces, resulting in 1,000 deaths. The son of Philippe Égalité, who had voted for the execution of King Louis XVI, took the throne under the name Louis-Philippe. It was the start of a new era, and no longer that of Madame Le Brun. She gave herself over to memories of happier times. For a dozen years, she took notes and wrote, aided by her nieces, who copied out the manuscript. She appended corrections in the margin.
Presumably, she began to write her memoirs when she wrote her first will. It's as if she felt at peace with herself, and that it was time to let herself write down her memories. I think it was a much deeper desire, that of wanting to live a second time and to relive those moments of happiness, because there's something very characteristic in the writing of these memoirs that radiates a glow of happiness, of discovery, and the most negative things in her life were only to be found in the accompanying documents.
So she wanted to leave a portrait of herself that she herself sanctioned. So she started, she listened to the advisors, and she started to write them. And it used to be said that she didn't actually write them. There were ghostwriters who worked for her. This is not true, because we know that there are big batches of her original manuscripts.
Though these memoirs are a precious document in terms of the worlds she encountered, they're equally important as an account of her own life. Madame Vigée Le Brun recalled a scene with Marie Antoinette, whose veracity still causes controversy.
One day, I happened to miss the appointment she had given me for a sitting. Far gone in my second pregnancy, I had suddenly become unwell. The next day, I hastened to Versailles to offer my excuses. Her Majesty was finishing her toilet. My heart was beating violently, for I knew that I was in the wrong. But the Queen looked up at me and said most amiably, "I was waiting for you all the morning yesterday. What happened to you?" "I'm sorry to say, Your Majesty," I replied, "I was so ill that I was unable to comply with Your Majesty's commands. I am here to receive more now, and then I will immediately retire." "No, no, do not go," exclaimed the Queen. "I do not want you to have made your journey for nothing." She revoked the order for her carriage, and she gave me a sitting. I remember that in my confusion and my eagerness to make a fitting response to her kind words, I opened my paint box so excitedly that I spilled my brushes on the floor. I stooped down to pick them up. Never mind, said the Queen, and for aught I could say, she insisted on gathering them all up herself.
Naturally, it's good for Vigée Le Brun's ego to say that the Queen picked up her brushes, and that's what you'd put in your memoirs. Many testimonies support the assertion that Marie Antoinette was a simple woman, close to her suppliers, who sometimes dispensed with protocol. So this anecdote seems probable. Its inclusion in her memoirs indicates that Vigée Le Brun attached a lot of importance to this too. There's a tendency to embellish the past that's quite natural, and to favor the good memories. You can at once be quite sincere, and yet, in reality, it may be a lie from a strictly historical perspective. But this doesn't mean her version is insincere.
Aged almost 80, Madame Vigée was still a famous personality in Paris. Summer Sundays in Louveciennes, winter in her Parisian apartment in the Saint-Lazare neighborhood, she threw parties where the younger generations, drawn by her reputation, would love to hear her anecdotes. Chateaubriand, Vigny, Musset, and Balzac seemed fascinated by this woman, a brilliant conversationalist who was once painter to Marie Antoinette and the courts of Europe.
She had a poetic sensibility and received Vigny at her Salon. She received Chateaubriand. She liked reading Lamartine, although she didn't really appreciate Victor Hugo's novel, Notre-Dame de Paris.
Politically, she resembles a person like Chateaubriand, who was very much in favor of a constitutional monarchy. I think she would have preferred the old regime as it was, but a constitutional monarchy would have worked for her also.
This sensitivity to new forms and new poetry changed her taste.
She was on the lookout for what was happening. She heard of Chopin and things like that. It was her musical gateway to what we might call modernity. It heralded the Romantic generation, which interested her.
Artists of 1840 rediscovered the charm of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and embraced neo-Gothic fashion. In painting, the ruins of cathedrals replaced Hubert Robert's Roman remains. In tandem with the troubadour-style nostalgia, mid-19th century France was undergoing profound social, economic, and political change. The accession of the bourgeoisie to manufacturing and financial affairs proved a huge shot in the arm for economic growth. This was the Industrial Revolution, which was accompanied by the rise of railways and technical advances in new energies, textiles, and metallurgy. It might be fun to imagine the doubtful reaction of Queen Marie Antoinette's portraitist faced with these curious miniatures bearing the strange name daguerreotypes, which first appeared in 1835. The static bodies, frozen expressions, poor quality rendering, and the crudeness of reality probably inspired thoughts of the end of a world, her world, that of a talented portrait artist who knew so well how to embellish the face and to convey the soul. She passed away quietly in April 1842, attended by her nieces. Having painted more than 660 portraits, known fame and criticism, luxury and exile, monarchies and revolutions, the greatest artists and the most powerful Europeans of her time. Having covered countless tens of thousands of kilometers, the tireless traveler, 87 years old, chose this epitaph for her grave in Louveciennes. Here, at last, I rest.